Hello and welcome to NewsHour from the BBC World Service, coming to you live from London. I'm James Kamarasamy. In a moment, Sudan's president says he has a plan for the economy after more anti-government protests turn violent. And later in the programme, a genuine legend of musical theatre.
I don't write musicals for themes. I don't write musicals to make points, ever. Even West Side Story. May seem to be about racial prejudice, but it isn't what it's really about. It's about the theatre and how you blend music and lyrics and book together.
We'll meet a man named Stephen Sondheim, and he'll be telling us about his new show here in London. First, though, the Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir has used a televised address this evening, marking the country's Independence Day, to assure its citizens he has a roadmap to resolve the economic crisis, which has once again sent hundreds of protesters onto the streets of the capital, Khartoum. The protests, which have taken on an increasingly revolutionary tone, have been continuing for the past 2 weeks. Today's one, organised by professional workers, saw shouts of freedom, peace and justice as the demonstrators tried to march on the presidential palace. But they found security forces firing tear gas and, according to some reports, live rounds in their path. At least one person is reported to have been shot dead. Yusra El-Bagir is a freelance journalist in Khartoum. She came into contact with the security forces today.
Just moments before I was caught secretly filming, I saw a normal civilian walking down the street getting beaten and manhandled by security officers for lifting up his phone. He hadn't even filmed yet, but, just the thought or the prospect of, him filming had them already, abusing him and showing force. And moments later, I was caught and I experienced quite aggressive force from security officers. The car was locked, but they heavily, attacked hit the windows. They were going to break the windows. They were, trying to get at us anywhere. And then I unlocked the door and handed a burner local phone that I was using and kept, the phone that had the sensitive footage and had my, interactions with journalists from different media outlets. But they grabbed me by the shirt. They ripped my shirt down the middle. They hit the cameraman who was driving at the time on the back of his neck. They shook me until I handed my phone over. And then they, when I've handed it over, they said, "Don't film again," screamed it in my face. And, this is under the assumption that they just thought I was a normal civilian, not a journalist actually covering the story. I don't know what would have happened if they'd confirmed that I was actually covering the protest. So what we've seen is that they don't want the world to be able to watch how they're treating protesters on the streets of Khartoum.
That was Yusra El-Bagir in the Sudanese capital. Gillian Lusk is a British-based independent journalist who specialises in Sudan. What she learnt about the protests in Khartoum today.
Well, it's not only tear gas that's been used, I'm afraid, but they've been using live ammunition, the Sudan security forces, and at least 2 people have been shot in the head. This is very serious. These are unarmed civilians and they're being shot by their own governments. So people are rather disappointed that the world isn't saying very much about it at the moment over Christmas.
What's at the root of these protests?
The government has been there for nearly 30 years next June. It's never ceased to be brutal and Islamist during that time. It's a very corrupt and very brutal regime. It's not just a question of President Omar al-Bashir himself. It's a question of the whole party which rules, and it rules through the security services. So I'm afraid people are used to brutality, and I think they've just had enough.
Yes, because they're not used to getting out on the streets like this, though, are they?
No, there were quite big protests in September 2013, and then at least 200 people, again, unarmed civilians, were shot dead in the streets. But since then, it's been relatively quiet. But there is a tradition of civilian uprising in Sudan. They've overthrown 2 military governments in 1965 and 1985. And they're referring back to that. They're seeing this as the people taking power again.
But at the moment, the power, the brute force at least, seems to be with the government itself and the security forces.
That's right. But it's, of course, what we don't know and what is almost impossible to find out is what's going on within the regime, both within the security service, within the army, which is not necessarily in agreement with the security service, within the ruling party, within the presidential palace, because President Omar al-Bashir is not that popular necessarily within his own party. So you've got all these possible, definite pressures within the regime, and we can't really know what will happen in that respect. Will there be an internal coup? What would happen?
And how is President Bashir handling things so far?
Very aggressively. I mean, yesterday he spoke to senior police officers. He promised them cars. He promised them pay rises. He used a phrase which is very similar to saying an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. They should respond with force against the protesters.
The fact that he's offering inducements to the security services, does that suggest he feels that he doesn't have the support currently without doing something like that?
The police aren't the main institution in this. We're talking more about the army, and even more than that, about the National Intelligence and Security Service, which is known as NIS. And these are the people who really run the regime and have done from the start. And the army has often been sidelined. So it will be interesting to see how army officers might react. At the same time, the senior officers were Islamized many years ago, the senior officer corps, so that they were supposed to be on the side of the regime.
And when you say Islamized, just explain what that means.
The National Congress Party, which then called itself the National Islamic Front, seized power with specific aim of an Islamic, as they called it, revolution. But of course, they meant their version of Islam, overwhelming majority of Sudanese are Muslims. But it wasn't their kind of Islam that was proposed by the government. It was obviously a very jihadist, very aggressive kind, very exclusivist kind. And in fact, they say it's not Islam. And this is one thing that's turned people against the government so much. They feel their religion is being abused.
So as much as the economic conditions, which are nominally the reason for these latest protests?
Yes, an increase in bread prices triggered the protests initially in a town called Atbara in the north of Sudan, which is a traditional trades unionist stronghold. So it was the wrong sort of place to impose that increase. And that did trigger it. People are absolutely desperate. I think probably most people now, if they're not subsistence farmers, they're actually living off remittances from friends and relatives abroad. That's the only way they can get by now.
And is there a viable alternative to the current regime?
That's a good question. The opposition has over the years been rather prone to be divided. And of course, the government has done its best to divide it. But now they're really pulling together. The protests started without opposition organisation, but now the opposition parties, which is a whole spectrum of parties in Sudan, they're organising, they're supporting the protesters. They're saying we will form a, united centre, they're calling it, to carry things forward. I mean, the protesters are specifically calling for the overthrow of the regime. They're calling for freedom, they're calling for peace, justice. They're saying they want what they call the Kazan, which is the Sudanese word for the Islamists, out. It's very specifically political, and the opposition parties are now catching up on that. And, one hopes that they will be working hard, I'm sure they are, on policies for the future.
Gillian Lusk, a British-based independent journalist who specialises in Sudan. We have been in contact with the Sudanese government today, but they haven't been willing or available to speak to us just yet. Over the past few days here on NewsHour, we've been hearing from women in different parts of Yemen, one of the Arab world's poorest countries that's been devastated by a civil war which has pitched forces loyal to President Hadi against those allied to the Houthi rebel movement. 2018 comes to an end with tentative hopes for peace following talks between the two sides in Sweden. And we're going to end our series of reflections with those of the BBC's Nawal Al-Maghafi, one of the few reporters to gain access to a country that's not just at war, but in the throes of a humanitarian catastrophe.
In the main hospital in the Yemeni port city of Hodeidah, the malnutrition ward is overflowing with patients. In the corridor, a man is sat on the floor with two children beside him whose ribs are protruding under their pale skin. Inside the hospital ward, every bed held 2 or even 3 very skeletal children. A mother in her 30s is sat on the corner of a bed with her 9-year-old daughter Fatina on her lap. The child is thin and weak and gasping for air. Doctors say she urgently needs tests, but the hospital's labs are overwhelmed. Saliha told me that the local hospital in her village was closed. It took the family 3 days of hitchhiking with strangers to reach Hodeida's hospital. The war has really taken its toll on her, she said, pointing to her daughter. Now she just lays there until her body seizes again. The staff of the government-run hospital said they hadn't been paid for months. We're hungry, but we might as well come to work than starve to death at home. We can't go to war on the front line, but this is our way of fighting against the aggression, by saving people. Reporting on Yemen isn't an easy task. For the last few years, I've had to enter the country by making a 15-hour drive through remote areas to avoid the Yemeni government and Houthi rebel forces. Each trip reveals a rapidly deteriorating humanitarian situation.
It's not just the bombs and the bullets that civilians here have fled from. This war has shattered everything that kept people afloat. It's often called the forgotten war. But everyone I've spoken to here is crying out for help, pleading with the world to finally take notice.
Food shortages have plagued remote villages and have now spread to large cities in the country of 28 million. That along with a cholera outbreak that has killed thousands. Since the Yemeni government lost control of Sana'a, the capital, more than 3 years ago, thousands of teachers, doctors and civil servants haven't been paid by the government and are struggling to find food and other basic necessities. Meanwhile, Houthi rebels have looted state resources in the areas under their control and have used the tax system to fund military operations instead of public services. During my last trip this year, we toured a camp on the outskirts of the southern city of Aden. It housed hundreds of internally displaced people who fled the latest clashes in the port city of Hodeida. Parents in the camp washed their children in the open air with water from a bucket, and then, with their clothes on, washed themselves. As we filmed, an old woman approached me and invited us into a makeshift tent, which was now her home. Inside, a row of children, her grandkids, all of them pale and thin. She cried as she told me of the fighting that forced her out of her beloved home. I told her the news of a ceasefire that was being brokered at the United Nations peace talks in Sweden, a world away from Yemen. Her eyes lifted in a smile. "Does that mean I'll go home and that we will live in peace?" she asked. "Inshallah," I said, that's what the new year will bring. Peace for you and for the whole of Yemen.
And that was the BBC's Nawal Al-Maghafi with the last in our series of reflections on the situation in Yemen. You're listening to the BBC World Service. This is NewsHour, coming to you live from London with James Kumarasamy. Coming up in the programme, the incumbent Prime Minister of Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina, has won a landslide victory in the general election, despite credible complaints from opposition figures of vote rigging. So, how did the Prime Minister respond to those allegations?
What Ms. Hasina said to me was that if any irregularities were found, then both the Election Commission as well as the law enforcement agencies would annul the result in that area and fresh polls would be held.
We'll have more on that in about 15 minutes' time. A reminder of our other headlines here on the BBC World Service. In a televised address to the nation, the Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir has insisted he can resolve the challenges facing his country. At least one protester has been shot dead during another day of anti-government demonstrations. And the World Food Programme has told Houthi rebels in Yemen to stop stealing food aid in parts of the country under their control. You're listening to the BBC World Service. This is NewsHour, coming to you live from London with James Kumarasamy. The first woman to win the Nobel Prize for Physics in half a century, and NASA landing a probe on Mars, just two of the scientific highlights of 2018. So, what discoveries might 2019 bring? Our science correspondent Victoria Gill begins her look into the scientific crystal ball, if that's not a contradiction in terms, with something we'll be hearing more about later on in the programme, the outbreak of Ebola in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Although the risk of global spread is low, it remains very high for neighbouring countries.
Something that brought the medical research community back down to earth was another outbreak of Ebola in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Jeremy Farrar is the director of the Wellcome Trust, one of the largest research charities in the world.
The next month is is absolutely critical to whether this epidemic is brought under control in the next 2 to 3 months or it's going to dominate the headlines in 2019.
But even with the perils of dealing with a lethal disease outbreak in a war zone, Dr. Farah says he thinks 2019 will be the year that science turns the tide on Ebola.
I do believe that in 2019 and going into 2020, we will be able to show that Ebola is a preventable disease with a vaccine, and if patients do get Ebola, we will have treatments so that we can turn Ebola to a preventable and treatable infection, and that will take away much of the understandable horror about this disease. And thinking more broadly, if we can do that for Ebola, I believe we can do that for a number of other really frightening emerging infections like Lassa fever and Nipah and Marburg, all the diseases which sort of fill everybody with real horror. I believe that many of the diseases are actually being neglected, but actually they're scientifically solvable.
Right now, we're facing a man-made disaster of global scale. Our greatest threat in thousands of years, climate change. If we don't take action, the collapse of our civilizations and the extinction of much of the natural world is on the horizon.
Last October, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a final warning about the urgent need to limit global temperature rise, and the world seemed finally to wake up to the urgency of global warming. In 2019, a different international panel of scientists will publish a report, this time aiming to deliver a wake-up call about the threat to nature and biodiversity.
Nature is all around us. I would say that the right to enjoy the living fabric of life is not a luxury, it's part of your birthright for everyone.
Professor Sandra Diaz is co-chair of the Global Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services Assessment, not a snappy title, but this report, set to be released in the summer, has the lofty goal of outlining just how human society can thrive without destroying what Professor Diaz calls the living fabric of our planet.
This is going to be the first truly global report in more than 10 years about biodiversity, ecosystems, and what they mean for people. Not only that, this is going to be the first intergovernmental report about it.
The first ever intergovernmental report
on biodiversity, ecosystems, and what it means for people's quality of life. People in highly urban and artificial places may not realize that they couldn't possibly survive without the living fabric. Our food, a lot of the things we wear, a lot of our physical and symbolic world every day, even if you live on the top of a very tall building in the middle of a really dense city, has to do with nature.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
It will be 50 years in 2019 since NASA first landed a human on the moon, and it will be a big year for space travel. China and India are sending their own probes to the moon, while the US Space Agency is boldly going where no mission has been before.
On New Year's Eve and New Year's Day 2019, NASA's New Horizons space probe will explore the farthest worlds ever explored in history.
Alan Stern is the principal investigator for the New Horizons mission. Launched more than a decade ago, it will bring in the new year by sweeping past a 30-kilometre wide object that's been named Ultima Thule.
And that was BBC Science correspondent Victoria Gill. We'll get more now on that New Horizons mission to Ultima Thule that Victoria mentioned. It's the furthest object a spacecraft has ever gone to investigate, 6.5 billion kilometres from Earth. New Horizons is due to fly past it at 05:33 GMT on the 1st of January. That's just half an hour into the new year in Maryland in the United States, where the mission team will be anxiously awaiting any news. One of those team members is Hal Weaver, a project scientist on the mission and a professor at Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory. He's been telling me why Ultima Thule was worth going all that way for.
Ultima Thule is a a member of the Kuiper Belt. It resides in what we call the third zone of the solar system, outside of the orbit of Pluto and Neptune, only discovered in the early 1990s. It's this vast swarm of material. Ultima Thule is in the densest portion of the Kuiper Belt. We call this region the Kuiper Belt. The first zone of the solar system is the terrestrial planet region, the relatively small rocky objects, Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars. You step into the next zone. The second zone is the realm of the giant planets. And that's all we knew about before the early 1990s. But now we're stepping further in.
Further in? And what do we know? Have we got any idea what it looks like?
Well, the only telescope that's been able to observe it so far has been the Hubble Space Telescope. It's just a little pinpoint of light and very hard to even detect at all, even with the most powerful observatory available. We did see the shadow of Ultima Thule in July of 2017, as Ultima Thule, as you viewed it from a telescope on the surface of the Earth and looked at a star, you could watch the shadow, you could watch the Ultima Thule occult the view of the star. And so you can imagine the shadow of Ultima Thule passing across the surface of the Earth. And we had 5 cords, 5 different telescopes on the ground that were able to see the flashing out of the starlight. And from that, that gave us some idea that it's a highly elongated object, maybe even double-lobed or whatever. And that together with the Hubble measurements, the pinpoint of light, was all we had, basically.
Well, we can hear the excitement in your voice just from the shadow. So when you actually get the images from New Horizons, well, that will break the bank, won't it?
Oh, gosh. It's so funny being here as we're, getting closer and closer. Yesterday, we were about 7 times farther than the Earth-Moon distance from Ultima Thule. Now we're, more like 4 times, and it's just getting closer and closer. But we finally have, been able to what we call resolve Ultima Thule. It's more than a pinpoint of light, but it's still only a couple of pixels across. So it's a pixelated blob. But you wouldn't believe how excited all the scientists are just to see that it's finally revealing itself. But it just gets better and better each day. Tomorrow we'll have, like 5 or 6 pixels, and then the next day 100 pixels across, and then the next day after that 200 pixels.
Quite a moment, and 50th anniversary, of course, of the first man on moon.
Yes, it's wonderful. This is, space exploration. As far as we're out at the frontier, this is the frontier of planetary science, the frontier of the solar system.
And that was Hal Weaver from Johns Hopkins University in the United States. And, of course, here at NewsHour, we'll be waiting to see those pictures of Ultima Thule as well. And we'll bring you the stories of any new discoveries that they reveal. And just a reminder, at the frontier, the final frontier of podcasting is NewsHour, because we have 2 editions of the programme a day that you can download for free if you miss any live editions of the programme. Just look for BBC NewsHour podcast in your search engine. You're listening to NewsHour from the BBC World Service with James Kumarasamy. Coming up next, the latest on the disputed election in Bangladesh. First, though, the winner of this year's election in Brazil will be sworn into office on New Year's Day. The far-right Jair Bolsonaro won power by promising to end corrupt politics and boost the economy. But will business interests take precedence ahead of the protection of Brazil's large indigenous population and environmental concerns? Our South America correspondent Katie Watson reports now from Brazil's agricultural heartland, Mato Grosso do Sul.
All visitors to the Guapoi Amambai reservation are welcomed with a prayer. People from the Kiowa tribe are tapping their bare feet and large bamboo poles on the dry red mud floors of the thatched prayer hall, while the cacique or chieftain shakes a rattle shaped from a gourd. Tradition here is everything, but it's a way of life that's under threat. In Mato Grosso do Sul, much of the land has been taken over by farmers' crops. But as well as being Brazil's breadbasket, the state is home to the second largest indigenous population after the Amazon. It's here where indigenous communities wanting their ancestral lands back are pitted against powerful farming interests wanting a profit, often ending in violent conflict. Bolsonaro has said he won't give a centimetre more land to indigenous communities once he's president. For indigenous leaders like Eliseo Lopez, Bolsonaro represents a huge threat.
Violence will only increase. Accused of dragging down the economy, of squatting on people's land, we are treated worse than animals. We have our own culture, our own way of living, our own language. Our rights need to be respected.
Estamos vizinhos da aldeia, eu tenho há 35 anos aqui.
I meet farmer Nivaldo Kruger, who's spraying pesticides on his soya crops as the sun sets, trying to avoid the intense heat of these summer months. He tells me his rights count too. He points out the fields his family has worked for more than 30 years. In one corner, indigenous communities have tried to take back land. He's fed up fighting and thinks Bolsonaro will be on his side.
There are big expectations. I think we are going to turn a page. The new government believes in the importance of agriculture industry for Brazil.
The fear is, though, that with Bolsonaro in power, farmers will feel emboldened and the rights of the indigenous will fall by the wayside. Jair Bolsonaro's bid for presidency showed a very negative, racist side of Brazil, says State Prosecutor Marco Antonio Delfino.
You are worried about the hate speech, for sure. It's a kind of trigger from violence, and that people use hate speech that was like kind of common in the campaign.
Bolsonaro's made it clear where his allegiances lie, leaving indigenous communities wondering what this new president will mean for their future.
That report was from Katie Watson. You're listening to the BBC World Service, and this is NewsHour coming to you live from our studios in central London with James Kumarasamy. A landslide victory or a farcical one? Those are the two contrasting narratives about Sunday's parliamentary elections in Bangladesh, a mainly Muslim South Asian country of more than 160 million people. The landslide victory has been claimed by the incumbent Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, whose Awami League has won almost all of the 300 constituencies that were up for grabs. The opposition alliance, which has officially secured just 7 of the contested seats, has employed the F-word farce, alleging irregularities, including voter intimidation, in more than 2/3 of the constituencies. It's called for a rerun of the election, but the country's electoral commission has ruled that out. So how has Sheikh Hasina reacted to the allegations? The BBC's Yogita Limaye is in the Bangladeshi capital, Dhaka.
She held a meeting with foreign observers and journalists at her official residence today, and one of the first things she said was that she thought that elections had been conducted in a free and fair manner. I, of course, put a more specific question to her about the allegations of the rigging of results, which had come in from several parts of Bangladesh. Also, the specific video recorded by a BBC Bengali service reporter from the Chittagong area, where they basically have footage of a ballot box which had been filled even before the polling began. And what Ms. Hasina said to me was that if any irregularities were found, then both the Election Commission as well as the law enforcement agencies would annul the result in that area and fresh polls would be held.
And on the wider point, did she engage at all? Because, as you say, that's just one piece of evidence, that there are plenty of other anecdotes that have come out across the country, aren't there?
Well, that's right. I mean, one of the other things she said was that, out of 40,000 polling booths, the reports of vote rigging, according to her and according to information that she had only come from a small number of polling booths. So in that sense, suggesting that on a larger scale, the election result was fair, that, this is people who had voted for her.
In terms of outside election observers, is there a presence at all?
The foreign observers who were present at the meeting today, I mean, many of them were people from other South Asian countries. We also did see a Canadian contingent there. But even before the election had started, the EU had decided not to send observers here. We also had the US State Department actually raise concerns because a US-funded election observer group had not been granted visas to come in. Just to tell you a little bit of what we saw here, because we were here on the last 2 days of campaigning actually, and on the streets of Dhaka, there were big marches taken out by supporters of the Prime Minister's Awami League Party, thousands of people out on the streets. It was actually really hard to find any opposition campaigning. We only saw some small door-to-door campaigns. They say that was because they were not given permission to hold any big rallies by the Election Commission. They also say, their activists and their party workers were threatened and intimidated. Of course, as I said, Ms. Hasina specifically denies these allegations. She said the opposition is making these claims, but they don't have any proof to back it.
Yogita Limaye in Dhaka. So what does all of this mean for Bangladesh, and have these elections changed anything? Charulata Hogg is the Associate Fellow for the Asia Pacific Programme at the Chatham House think tank.
This year, it's been a good election in terms of the number of participation by political parties, but not a good election in terms of the way it has been managed, the way the process has gone. So we've seen large-scale voter intimidation, we've seen ballot boxes being stuffed, we've seen a massive attack on the opposition, which has begun ever since Sheikh Hasina, took this position from 2014, and virtually, half of the BNP is behind bars, including that's the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, including its leader on graft charges. So there is no credible opposition, and this was not a free and fair election, I think, by any yardstick.
Where does that leave her legitimacy, do you think?
It's a difficult question because Sheikh Hasina would have possibly won this election, not with the same sweeping majority that 96% of the vote, not with the same majority, but she would have won this election because
in any case,
because the country is making good economic progress and people are getting employment. There is support for Sheikh Hasina. There isn't support for her authoritarian ways, for sure, but a section of the population has benefited from her being Prime Minister and from her party's leadership.
As far as the international picture is concerned, are other countries worried about the direction Bangladesh is taking? I mean, is this turn of events something that matters to the region and beyond?
It's quite a complex picture because the very traditionalist view was that the opposition party, which is the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, was aligned with the Jamaat-e-Islami, which is the party of collaborators, the anti-liberators of Bangladesh, very hardlined, and therefore there were concerns about the revival of hardline Islamic militancy with the JI and BNP in power. But then you have Sheikh Hasina, who has a rather unsavory alliance with the Hafazat Islam, which is a party that calls for the revival of Sharia law, which is, if not equally, if not more hardline than the Jamaat. So the very clear-cut distinction that existed in terms of which political parties would provide support to a more radicalized Bangladesh, that sort of formula doesn't apply anymore because I think it's all politics of convenience at the moment. In terms of Bangladesh's immediate relationships, it's also been traditionally thought that Sheikh Hasina, being a more moderate leader, was therefore less pro-Muslim and more pro-India and had a better relationship with India. But I think that is also not such a fact we can take for granted anymore. We've had China make serious inroads into Bangladesh under Sheikh Hasina's regime. We've had a massive Chinese investment. All this causes great discomfort to India. So it's all sort of economic at the moment rather than geopolitical, which used to be the simpler way of looking at things. For the Western Western world, the Sheikh Hasina's general receptivity towards receiving Rohingya refugees has put her in a favourable light, and the West has found it easy to do business with Sheikh Hasina. So what does it spell in terms of the geopolitical scene and in terms of the regional politics remains quite unclear. But for now, I think it's going to be business as usual. We've had Sheikh Hasina in positions, in power since 2009.
Sharu Latta Hogg from Chatham House. At the age of 88, the Grand Master of Musical Theatre, Stephen Sondheim, is still creating and still open to having his earlier creations being reinterpreted. The main character in the latest production of his 1970 musical Company in London's West End has been changed, with his blessing, from a man into a woman. Nicola Stambridge has been speaking to Stephen Sondheim and to one of the stars of the new gender-reversed production.
Backstage at London's Gielgud Theatre production of Company by Stephen Sondheim, star and musical legend Patti LuPone gets ready to play Joanne.
Start to apply the makeup and then the character reveals itself.
Here's to the girls in their prime, aren't they too much? Keeping house but clutching a copy of Time just to keep in touch.
Steve's music is very complicated. In America, he's our poet laureate. He's the man. Everybody aspires to be able to sing accurately a Sondheim score. Right now, he's the king of musical theatre.
We're okay.
Busy wrangling his dogs.
And if they bark, they bark.
Stephen Sondheim spoke to us from his home in New York. The new Company has a new Bobby, a bachelorette replacing a bachelor. Is this for a Me Too era? Is this because musicals should chime with the times?
The whole idea of relevance makes me, I don't know what to say. I just think it's ridiculous. Any story you tell at any given time is relevant. There's no such thing as an irrelevant story, play, or movie, or anything like that. I don't write musicals for themes. I don't write musicals to make points, ever. Even West Side Story. May seem to be about racial prejudice, but it isn't what it's really about. It's about the theater and how you blend music and lyrics and book together. My parents got divorced when I was 11. My mother had custody of me and moved to Pennsylvania, and within a few miles of the Oscar Hammerstein family. They had a son my age, so we became friends, and I gradually osmosed into the Hammerstein family. Oscar became my surrogate father. In every way, my mentor.
Let me go away from the Mississippi. Let me go away from the white man boss.
What he pioneered was, and it was very experimental in those days, was the idea of telling a story through songs. Opera had done it for many years, but musicals had never, or rarely had done that. One of the first ones was Showboat, which was his.
Oh, man, river, that old man river, he must know something.
That was probably the first musical that took on what you would call serious themes, in that particular story, racial miscegenation. But I don't think that's why he wrote it. It was part of a story that he wanted to write.
Oh, what a beautiful morning. Oh, what a beautiful day. I got a beautiful feeling, and everything's going my way.
Musicals, at least up until the last generation, were strictly for lighthearted entertainment, evenings out. Rodgers and Hammerstein changed that with Oklahoma, 1943, where they pointed out that maybe a musical could tell a story instead of just being a lot of chipper songs and dances.
It's 60 years since West Side Story played in the West End in London, and now I understand you're involved with Steven Spielberg's film version.
Yes, the script by Tony Kushner is absolutely brilliant as far as I'm concerned. And it's quite different, not in plot and not the characters, but in terms of treatment, influenced, of course, by Spielberg and his imagination. There's also going to be a stage production on Broadway in the next season, and that will also be an entirely different stylistic approach.
Are you still writing and composing new work all the time?
Yes, I'm working on a musical and have been for a year, based on 2 movies by Louis Buñuel. Actually, the libretto is almost finished, and I'm about halfway through the score.
Sleep, sleep, I couldn't sleep tonight, not for all
I saw My Fair Lady with Julie Andrews.
I could have danced all night.
And I was quite young, and you're sitting in what you guys call the gods. It's almost unreal. First of all, you're sitting way, 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 way up in a theater and looking down on magic. That's the power of musical theater, in the joy of someone bursting into song, the heightened reality of it, and the awesomeness of what you're witnessing on the stage.
And that was the actress and singer Patti LuPone, ending that report by Nicola Stambridge on the new Stephen Sondheim production in London. You're listening to NewsHour from the BBC World Service. A reminder of our top story this hour. In the face of growing protests against his rule, President Omar al-Bashir of Sudan has promised to address economic concerns and to hold free elections in 2020. At least one protester has been shot dead during another day of anti-government demonstrations. Gillian Lusk is a British-based journalist who specialises in Sudan. She told us that human rights abuses and dire economic conditions are the root causes of the protests.
People are absolutely desperate. I think probably most people now, if they're not subsistence farmers, they're actually living off remittances from friends and relatives abroad. That's the only way they can get by now.
Other headlines this hour. The World Food Programme has urged Houthi rebels in Yemen to stop stealing aid deliveries. And the US Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren has taken a big step towards entering the 2020 presidential race. You're listening to the BBC World Service. This is NewsHour, coming to you live from London with James Kamarasamy. Votes are being counted in the Democratic Republic of Congo following Sunday's election, but not everyone who wanted to was able to cast a ballot. Voting in parts of North Kivu province was postponed because of security fears linked to the current Ebola outbreak. And that decision has provoked a great deal of anger. The aid agency, the International Rescue Committee, says it has been forced to suspend its support for local health facilities. I asked its field director, Nora Love, why they'd done that.
On Wednesday, the DRC government announced that they were postponing the elections in Beni and Butembo until March, which meant those communities would not be voting in the presidential part of the election. And one of the reasons that they gave for that postponement was the Ebola virus being in those areas, which then indicated that the Ebola was a political reason for the delay in the elections, which made us vulnerable to repercussions.
But would you say that there is a risk to members of the public to vote with the current Ebola outbreak?
No, I would not. I would say that Ebola is a very fragile disease. And so if somebody is not symptomatic, you will not be transmitting the disease.
So in your view, this was a purely political decision, was it?
I think that we could have took the precautions to ensure safeguardings. And in Beni yesterday, they did set up polling stations themselves and people went and voted. And it was a very peaceful exercise that they were able to conduct. So I think that, yeah, they could have gone forward with it.
So what now for you? Are you just waiting for the worst of the current storm to come to an end and then heading back?
Well, there's a couple of things. Yesterday, the civil societies in Butembo and Beni released statements saying that the Ebola response workers should be left undisturbed and that they shouldn't be looked at as the reason for not being able to have the vote. That was a very positive message coming from the civil society. We will see in regards to how the election results come out in the next couple of days and in the reaction from that.
And so in the time being, you're just sort of waiting and relying on local staff?
Yeah, so we have over 100 staff within the Ebola response, and we pulled out about 23 of them. And our local staff include doctors and nurses and other people that have been trained for the Ebola response. So depending on the security on the ground, they will hopefully resume work on the 2nd, and we'll be able to support them.
And leaving aside the question of the election and the passions that the delay has stirred, what is security like for you in general in that part of DRC?
I mean, that part is very fragile. This area has been in a conflict area for 20 years. There's ongoing clashes between various armed groups. And then you do have the communities with resistance, but I feel like that is more instigated when there has been a particular death or something related to a particular community affected by the Ebola.
And at the present time, to what extent is the outbreak contained?
I don't think it's contained yet. We had no activities for at least 2 days in these communities. So then there's chances that the virus is still out there in the community and we don't know where it is. So the outbreak itself is still not contained.
Nora Love from the IRC speaking to me from Rwanda. One of the most significant events of 2019 will be the UK's exit from the European Union. Brexit is due to take place on March the 29th, but no one knows what form it will take, with the deal struck between the EU and the UK still not approved by British MPs. President Trump is also lukewarm. In November, he said it sounded to him like a great deal for the EU. So, what could the future relationship between the UK and the US look like? Woody Johnson is America's ambassador to the UK. He's been giving my colleague Nick Robinson his assessment of the mood in this country.
One of the things that I notice is the mood is very much more pro-American than is reported frequently, which doesn't surprise me. The disagreements seem to get over-focused on, but when I'm out talking to people, whether it's fishermen at Peterhead or Ramsgate or northern Scotland, talking to the oil people, I just feel a positivity that is not well represented. I'm feeling the country is in need of leadership. But at the end of the day, I'm very positive. I'm very impressed by the people that I've talked to.
And you have been clear that you were surprised, I think startled was the word you used, by a sort of defeatism about Brexit. You still detect that?
Yeah, I think so, because, all of the reporting looks back. And it looks in a very static future rather than active, kind of a British future, about solving problems and entrepreneurialism and taking advantage of opportunities and being very innovative.
And yet the president, in one of those sayings that you as a diplomat had to smooth over, described the Prime Minister's Brexit deal as a great deal for the EU.
What I'm focusing on here is something the president has also said, that he is looking forward to and hoping that the environment will lead to the ability of the U.S. to do a quick, very massive bilateral trade deal that could be the precursor of future trade deals with other countries around the world, for Great Britain, that will really take you way, way into an exciting future.
And how is that progressing?
Well, we're still going through the stages of deciding where exactly the country is going. If it goes in a way that allows these kinds of agreements to occur, then I think that'll be very positive in the president's eyes.
But if the Prime Minister gets the deal that the President described as a great deal for the EU, that quick, massive bilateral trade deal won't be possible.
Well, it doesn't look like it would be possible.
And when you point that out to ministers, to the Prime Minister, do they look concerned? Do they understand what's at stake?
I think they do understand, but there are trade-offs in the situation they're dealt with, and so they're going to have to measure the impact of all the other trade-offs, in terms of how important these kind of new trade arrangements would benefit the people in the country.
There are some around the Prime Minister who hope that after Brexit, the first big visit to the UK will be the President himself in that postponed state visit. Is there a prospect of that happening?
That would be great. I think the President would be in favor of it. So, yeah, if we can do that, that would be, I think, a big positive.
US Ambassador to the UK, Woody Johnson. Now, it won't be 2019 for another 2 hours here in London, but there have already been spectacular New Year's celebrations in other parts of the world. We'll wave goodbye to 2018 on NewsHour with some of the sounds from Hong Kong. From me, James Kimarasamy, and the entire team here, thanks for spending the past year with us, and we hope to have your company in the new one.
NewsHour has been a download from the BBC. To discover more and our terms of use, visit bbc.com/podcasts.